I just gave him flowers. Why did he do this for me? Emma, a florist who believed in kindness, noticed an elderly man sitting outside her shop, lost in sorrow. Hoping to bring him a moment of comfort, she offered him flowers, thinking it was just a small act of kindness. But an hour later, an unexpected visitor stepped into her shop, a lawyer sent by the elderly man handing her a legal contract that made her break down in tears. Little did she know, her small act of kindness would change her life in ways she never imagined. Hi everyone, welcome back to Unveiled Narratives. Today I have another heartfelt story to share with you. That'll be $3, Emma said, setting the small bouquet on the counter. The customer nodded, placed the bills down, and took the wrapped flowers with a polite smile before heading for the door. The bell chimed softly as it swung shut behind her, leaving the shop in silence once more. After hours of waiting, this is her first sale of the day, and now, with the shop empty again, she has no idea when the next one will come. Her gaze falls to the open ledger beside her. The numbers tell the same grim story they have for months: declining sales, overdue bills, and a future slipping further out of reach. She has tried everything: discounts, promotions, even shifting online, but nothing has changed. The bigger florists down the street, with their dazzling displays and endless options, continue to draw customers away. The decision is already made. In a few days, she will close the shop for good, selling off whatever remains and walking away from the dream she spent years building. She sighs and turns toward the large front window. Outside, the sidewalk still holds a faint shimmer from last night's rain, reflecting the muted gray of the morning sky. Her gaze drifts absently until it settles on a familiar figure, an elderly man sitting on the bench near the lamppost, just as he always does. Emma has noticed him many times before. Every morning, after his walk, he pauses there, resting for a few minutes before continuing on his way. He never lingers for long. Their eyes have met on occasion, and he always gives a polite nod, the kind strangers exchange in passing. Brief, simple, familiar. But today is different. He wasn't just taking a short break. He had been sitting there for a long time, his shoulders slumped forward, hands clasped together, eyes fixed downward. There was no nod of acknowledgement, no passing glance in her direction. His usual quiet composure had been replaced by something heavier. A pang of concern tugged at Emma's chest. Then it struck her. She hadn't seen him for a few days. Had something happened? For a moment she hesitated. It wasn't her place to ask. But as she watched him, she felt a quiet pull inside her. Before she could second-guess herself, Emma stepped around the counter, pushing open the shop's glass door. She walked toward the bench, her steps light but intentional. "Morning," she said softly as she approached. At first, the man didn't react. His gaze remained fixed on the pavement, lost in a place far beyond this quiet street. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. Emma offered a small, warm smile. "I hadn't seen you for a few days. I just wanted to check on you." For a moment he remained silent. Then, with a shaky breath, he spoke. "My wife passed away last week," he said, "and I wasn't there. I was out of town for work. By the time I got back, she was already gone." Emma's chest tightened. She knelt beside the bench, her fingers brushing the worn wood. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't imagine how hard that must be." He nodded, his lips trembling. "I never got to say goodbye. She was in the hospital, and I should have been there. I should have held her hand one last time." His voice wavered, thick with regret. He turned his face away as if trying to steady himself, but the weight of loss was too much to hide. Emma didn't speak right away. Some grief wasn't meant to be answered, it was meant to be heard. So she let the silence settle, giving him space to feel, to breathe. But as she watched him, a quiet ache stirred within her. She couldn't take away his pain, but maybe she could offer him something small, something that might soften the weight of his sorrow, even if only for a moment. Her gaze drifted toward the flowers inside her shop. Over the years, she had watched countless customers walk in, their expressions shifting at the sight of fresh blooms. Flowers had a way of reaching people, of making them feel seen. Even those who hadn't expected them couldn't help but smile. She rose to her feet. "Wait here," she said gently. Slipping back inside, she scanned the rows of flowers. Her shop might have been struggling, but the meaning behind the blooms had never faded. With careful hands, she began selecting each stem with intention. White lilies for remembrance, pink carnations for gratitude, and blue forget-me-nots, for memories too precious to be lost. Each flower carried a quiet message, woven together into something both delicate and profound. She wrapped the stems carefully, tying them with a soft satin ribbon. It wasn't much, but she hoped that, in some small way, they would bring him comfort. With the bouquet cradled in her hands, Emma stepped back outside. The morning air felt different now, lighter somehow, carrying the gentle scent of fresh blooms. She walked toward the bench, her steps slow and deliberate. As she knelt slightly to meet his gaze, she extended the bouquet toward him. "Flowers have a way of making people feel seen," she said gently. "Maybe they can do that for you today." The man hesitated. His fingers trembled as they brushed over the petals, a deep emotion tightening in his throat. For a moment he couldn't find the words. Then, in a whisper, he said, "My wife. She loved flowers. I used to bring her some every week." Emma nodded, her voice warm but steady. "Then let these be for her," she said. "And for you." A deep breath shuddered through him as he cradled the bouquet. His sorrow hadn't disappeared, but now it was softened by something else. A quiet comfort. A reminder that even in grief, kindness could bloom. For a long moment he simply held the flowers, his fingers tracing the delicate petals. Then, as if the weight in his chest had eased just a little, he exhaled deeply and spoke again. "We were married for 52 years, he said, his voice quieter now but steady. "She was my first love, and my last." Emma listened, sensing that he needed to share this, not just with her, but perhaps with himself. "You know, people always talk about how love changes over time, how it fades, how it loses its spark. But with her, it only got stronger. She had this way of making every ordinary day feel special. Even after all those years, just seeing her smile when I walked through the door, that was enough." A small, bittersweet smile ghosted his lips. "I used to joke that she tricked me into marrying her, but the truth is, I would have married her 100 times over." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. His words weren't just memories. They were love, woven into every syllable, still alive despite his grief. "She sounds like a wonderful woman," Emma said softly. He nodded, his grip on the bouquet tightening slightly. "She was." Emma rested a light hand on the edge of the bench, grounding herself in the moment. "She's still with you," she said softly. "In every memory, in every moment you shared, and in every flower that reminds you of her." The elderly man looked down at the bouquet, his fingers brushing against the delicate petals. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, with a slow, quiet nod, he exhaled. Emma offered a small smile. "I should head back in," she said gently. "But if you ever want to stop by, the flowers are always here." She turned toward the shop, expecting him to leave, but something made her glance back. The elderly man hadn't moved. His gaze lingered on the storefront, as if memorizing every detail, as if seeing it differently than before. Then, after a pause, he spoke. "Ma'am, before you go, what's your full name?" Emma blinked, slightly caught off guard. It wasn't an unusual question, yet something about the way he asked made her pause. "Emma Carter," she said, watching him closely. "Why?" A small, knowing smile touched his lips, though his eyes held something deeper, something unreadable. "I just wanted to remember the name of the person who reminded me of something important today." Emma tilted her head slightly. "And what's that?" she asked. The elder man's fingers traced the bouquet's ribbon, his touch careful, almost reverent. That kindness still matters. That being seen, even for a moment, can mean everything. There was a weight to his words, not heavy with grief but with quiet intention, as if, in that moment, he had made a decision she wasn't yet aware of. Emma watched as he rose from the bench and walked away, his steps slow but deliberate. She stood there a little longer, watching his figure fade into the distance, a strange feeling settling in her chest, one she couldn't quite name. As she stepped back inside her shop, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something quiet, yet significant. The morning passed in a haze. Emma moved through her routine, trimming stems, arranging fresh bouquets, but her mind kept circling back to the old man's words. Something about the way he'd said her name, the way he'd looked at her. It lingered, quiet, but persistent. She lost herself in the steady motions, hands moving from one task to the next. Minutes turned into an hour, the soft rustling of petals and distant hum of the city outside filling the silence. Then, just before noon, The shop bell rang again. She glanced up from the counter, expecting a customer. But the man who stepped inside wasn't browsing for flowers. He wore a crisp suit, a leather briefcase in hand, his presence exuding quiet authority. Everything about him, his posture, his steady gaze, felt too formal, too deliberate for a flower shop. Emma's stomach tightened. Lawyers didn't just walk into small shops like hers without a reason. He approached the counter and met her eyes. "Emma Carter?" he asked, as if confirming her identity. Emma hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes?" The man gave a slight nod, glancing around the shop before returning his attention to her. "I'm here on behalf of a client. They've asked me to deliver this to you." He reached into his folder, pulled out a sealed envelope, and placed it on the counter. Her name was printed in bold, precise letters. Emma stared at it, unease creeping in. What is this about?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. The lawyer adjusted his stance slightly. "My client will be here shortly to explain in detail. Until then, I advise you to open it." Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the envelope, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her chest. She could feel the lawyer's eyes on her as she slid a nail under the seal and carefully unfolded the contents inside. The first thing she saw was a contract, and as her eyes skimmed the words, her breath hitched. Her eyes scanned the contract again, but the words felt unreal. Her fingers tightened around the paper as confusion and disbelief tangled inside her. This wasn't a bill or a legal notice. It was something else. Something impossible that she never thought something come to her way like this. Tears burned in her eyes. She had spent years struggling, giving away flowers just to bring joy. Now, a stranger was offering something beyond her imagination. Her hand covered her mouth as a quiet sob escaped. Her shoulders shook under the weight of it all. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. Why did he do this for me?" The lawyer remained still, offering no further explanation. The paper in her hands blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She struggled to steady her breath, her fingers trembling against the impossible reality of what she was holding. Then, a gentle chime echoed through the shop, a familiar sound, yet somehow different this time. It wasn't just the bell announcing a customer. It was the moment everything changed. The elderly man stood in the doorway, his warm eyes filled with quiet understanding. Before she could think, her feet carried her forward. She reached for his hands, gripping them tightly, as if anchoring herself to something real. A shaky breath escaped her, her fingers pressing against the roughness of his skin. "You—" Her voice wavered. "You did this?" The old man's smile was gentle, almost knowing. "You were kind to me when you didn't have to be," he said softly. "Now, it's my turn." Emma's throat tightened. A lump formed as she blinked rapidly, trying to steady herself against the overwhelming rush of emotions. Emma pulled back slightly, her gaze drifting to the document still clutched in her trembling fingers. Taking a steadying breath, she lowered her eyes to the pages, scanning the words again, as if trying to convince herself this was real. It was a long-term contract, one that secured daily flower deliveries to hospitals, elderly homes, and shelters. Not just for a few months, but for years. Every expense was covered by the elderly man, every detail carefully arranged. The sheer scale of it was staggering. Her mind raced. This wasn't just a business deal, it was stability, a future she had never dared to imagine. No more worrying about slow months, about making ends meet. And more than that, her flowers, her work, would bring comfort to those who needed it most. Emma swallowed hard, emotions swelling in her chest. She looked up at the elderly man, her vision blurring with unshed tears. "Why me?" she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't have rare flowers. My shop is small. There are bigger florists, but they don't have your heart." The old man gently cut her off with a knowing smile. His gaze drifted toward the bouquet display, his expression softening with memory. "My wife loved flowers," he murmured, as if speaking to the past. "She always believed they could heal, that even a single bloom could bring light into someone's darkest days." For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, his eyes tracing the delicate petals as if seeing something beyond them. Then, with a quiet inhale, he turned back to Emma, his expression soft, yet resolute. "You reminded me of her. The flowers you gave me. They weren't just petals and stems. They were kindness, warmth, something I hadn't felt in a long time." Emma felt something tighten in her chest, the weight of his words settling deep. So now, the man continued, his voice steady but full of quiet emotion, I want to take that feeling, the one you gave me, and share it with others. People who are lonely, hurting, forgotten. I want them to feel what I felt, even for a moment. Emma let out a shuddering breath. No one had ever believed in her or her shop like this before. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, the man said with a small chuckle. Just keep doing what you do. Let the flowers speak for you. Emma blinked away the sting of emotion. This wasn't just paperwork, it was a new beginning. The lawyer, who had remained quietly observing, finally stepped forward and placed a pen beside the document. Whenever you're ready, Miss Carter, just a signature and we can move forward. His voice was professional but still gentle. Emma exhaled slowly, her fingers grazing the paper. She wasn't just signing a contract. She was stepping into something new, something she never saw coming. The next morning, Emma arrived at the shop earlier than usual. The air was crisp, and a soft golden light filtered through the windows. She found the elderly man already waiting, his warm smile steady as ever. Together, they carefully picked and arranged the freshest flowers, roses, lilies, daisies, each bouquet bursting with color and life. With boxes of flowers loaded into the man's car, they set off. Their first stop was the hospital. Inside, the sterile scent of disinfectant lingered in the air, but as Emma and the elderly man handed bouquets to the nurses, the atmosphere shifted. Nurses placed the flowers on bedside tables, and patients, some too weak to speak, managed faint smiles. A frail woman held a single rose close to her chest, her eyes brimming with quiet gratitude. Next, they visited an elder care home. The moment Emma stepped inside, she felt the weight of time in the air. Slow movements, distant gazes. But as she and the elderly man handed out flowers, the room softened. Wrinkled hands reached eagerly for the delicate blooms. One old man chuckled, tucking a daisy behind his ear, while a woman in a wheelchair whispered, "These remind me of my garden." Their final stop was the shelter. The mood was heavy, filled with exhaustion and uncertainty. But as Emma placed flowers on tables and handed small bouquets to mothers, the room changed. A little boy took a flower, twirling it in his tiny fingers before pressing it to his nose, grinning. A woman clutched her bouquet, blinking back tears. Emma watched it all unfold, the quiet magic of a simple gesture. It wasn't just about flowers, it was about hope, about reminding people they weren't invisible. As the days passed, Emma's flower shop transformed. What was once a quiet, struggling business now thrived with a newfound purpose. Orders increased, not just from the contract, but from people who had heard of her story, how a simple act of kindness had rippled outward. Each morning, she arranged flowers not just for customers, but for those who needed hope the most. The elderly man visited often, his presence a reminder of the day everything changed. Emma never expected anything in return for giving a single flower, yet it had reshaped her world in ways she never imagined. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring narratives. And if you believe in the power of kindness, share this with others. You never know who might need to hear it today. Also, check out the videos on your screen for more uplifting stories you won't want to miss.